you take nothing. Okay, and the common law would have said satisfaction applies unless we have an exception. The statute will reverse that common law presumption, as we'll see in just a moment. Okay. Look at, well, note 4 on page 153 before we get to the question to see how it works. With regard to wills executed on or after 2003, the satisfaction has to be documented in writing. And, all right, and that's the analogy. All right, so let's look at note 3 on page 153. Let's look at that question and see how the statute applies. Where do we find the statute, by the way? Where do we find the satisfaction statute? Where do we find this?
255-101, 255-102.
Exactly right. A state's code 255-101 through 102. So look at note 3 on page 153 of the case book. Father executed valid will leaving $20,000 to daughter. Thereafter, father gave $10,000 to daughter during lifetime to help her with law school expenses. $10,000 wouldn't go very far, would it? Sorry, law school. Sorry about that. Then father dies. Has daughter's legacy been partially satisfied? Why or why not? What do you think? How does 255.101 apply in that situation? The common law would have said yes. The daughter would have been partially satisfied, so the daughter would have only taken the other $10,000 that she was left under the will. Common law would have said that, but that's not the way the statute works. Mr. Navarro, you want to tell me?
Yes, sir, I'll try.
Okay.
From the reading of number 3, it doesn't appear that it's been partially satisfied because
you would need more facts to know, and we don't have facts to indicate that it's been partially satisfied. What would it mean? So, in other words, does daughter takes how much just under these facts? If there's nothing more, how much does daughter take?
20,000.
The whole 20,000, right? What would it require under 255.101 of the Estates Code? What would it require to vary that presumption to alter the will and say that satisfaction had occurred, and partial satisfaction?
One of 3 things would have had to occur.
Right?
The father's will specifically provides for the deduction of the lifetime gift.
All right, so first we would have to look and see if the will said something like, I leave $20,000 to my daughter, and any gift that I give her during my lifetime shall be deemed to be in satisfaction of this testamentary bequest or something like that. All right, the will can draft around it.
The second would be that the father declares in a writing contemporaneous with the gift that is to be deducted from or is in satisfaction of the gift.
All right, he's writing, and it has to be contemporaneous. Do you remember this? This was one of the advancement situations, right? That the giver, the donor of the gift during lifetime, the person who turns out to be the intestate decedent, would have to say in a contemporaneous writing that it was an advancement. Okay? Or
the third was that the daughter herself could have acknowledged in writing that the lifetime gift is in satisfaction of the gift.
That's right, the devisee. The devisee's right. I'll say a written acknowledgement, right? In other words, written acknowledgement, devisee's written acknowledgement that it's a satisfaction, right? The language is, you can say it was in satisfaction of the device, or you can say it should be done. Right, these two things are advancement. The statute on advancement is 2. Yeah, it tells you to look it up. 201, 151, and 152. Very common. You don't have to look it up now, but you can make a note of it. Those are in there. The difference is this third thing, because you look in the will. In the case of advancement, it's intestacy that is no will. Hence the difference, right? So you didn't have this third place to look in the case of advancement because there is no will. So you would if these were the only facts we had, and the will was silent, it doesn't say that father gave daughter $10,000, and at the time he gave her $10,000, he had a right there or later have her write an acknowledgement that this was going to be in satisfaction, or it didn't say when he gave her the $10,000, he also handed her writing saying this is in satisfaction or partial satisfaction of your gift under my will. But if the will was silent, then it hasn't been drafted around. The default rule is that it's not in satisfaction, right? It's not in satisfaction. Reverse of common law presumption, just like the advancement statute reversed the common law presumption as well. It's not in advancement, not satisfaction unless the will says it is, or in the case of advancement or satisfaction, the testator or the intestate sees it as a temporary reprisal or revising or the area. Okay. Question about that? All right. Let's see what else we have about this. Oh, how can you use your knowledge of satisfaction rules to prepare better estate plans for your clients? Actually, you could look at the sample will in the back of the book. Look on page, in your casebook, look on page 468, which is will section 2G. Will section 2G. Look at page 468 and look at what Professor Beyer has suggested in terms of satisfaction. 468, satisfaction. No gift of any kind that I make under this will shall be considered either fully or partially satisfied by any inter vivos gift that I hereafter make. Okay, now, does that need to be in the will? Actually, it doesn't need to be in the will, does it, right? Because that just follows the default rule under the statute. But the testator has at least made it very clear that it's not in satisfaction, so there can't be any argument. What about a contemporaneous, what about later testator and the beneficiary? The testator or the beneficiary goes back to the inter vivos gift and one of them executes that right. I presume that will override the statement in the will. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that it will. Alternatively, page 468, paragraph 2G, the testator could have said, every gift that I may make to one of the beneficiaries under this will shall be deemed in satisfaction, whole and part, or partial satisfaction. They could have drafted around the statute if they wanted. This was drafted in compliance with the statute. Okay, see that? Question about that? All right, so that's satisfaction. So you can't get no satisfaction. Sometimes you can get satisfaction. Sometimes you can't. Default rule will be the presumption is no satisfaction. 153, page 153, exoneration. Okay, and I had you skip the case as well. The case is on page 156 of the case, at the top of the page. There's the rule, what exoneration is. What exoneration is. And you see, exoneration it's hot as hell in here. I was here, a couple of you were here this afternoon in my afternoon class. I don't think it was this hot this afternoon. And I know what you're thinking. It's awful stuff, that hot air all putting on. I understand that. But I think it's not just all maybe part of it. Page 156. Here it is. Here's the rule. When the testator owes a debt, that's secured by a lien upon specific property, usually it was held to be real property. When the testator owes a debt secured by a lien upon specific property belonging to him, the debt, like any other personal debt, is to be paid out of the testator's personal estate in the absence of provisions in the will showing a contrary intention. So, for example, let's look at note 2. Look at note 2 on page 157. Note 2 on page 157. We're going to see how exoneration works. And let's talk about the common law rule. That's the common law rule. And then we'll talk about how the statute, there's a statutory rule that changed the common law rule. But let's look at this first. Note 1 on page 157, what's meant by exoneration? I just told you what's meant by exoneration. What policies support the rule? This is another one of those rules that's was there, is in place, is followed to carry out the testator's presumed intention when the will is silent. We're going to see how the modern rule works. Note 2 on page 156. Exoneration to frustrate the actual intent of the testator. For example, assume the testator had two children, Arthur and Brenda. Testator left his house worth $200,000 with a $100,000 mortgage on it to Arthur, and the residuary estate worth $100,000 to Brenda. Let's stop right there. $200,000 house with a $100,000 mortgage on it. What's the net value? What's the so-called equity of that house? $100,000, okay? So what testator appeared to have in mind was, gee, when testator drafted the will, $100,000 to my son, and then everything else, which is just worth about $100,000, I leave to my daughter, and that way it's more or less equal. If exoneration applies, page 156, if the will is silent, the common law rule was exoneration would apply. Exoneration applies, the mortgage is paid off. And where do you think it's paid off from? The residuary estate. So, Arthur would receive the house worth $200,000, $200,000 equity, because the mortgage would be paid off, and Brenda would get nothing, because it would be paid off out of the residuary estate, which was given to her. And that's not what testators would have. So, let's look at the statute. We have a statute that has changed the common law rule. Look at 255.301 of the estate code. 255.301 and 302. 301 has the new general rule that's buried the common law. Except is provided in 302, which is exception. A specific device passes to the devisee subject to each debt secured by the property that exists on the date of testator's death, and the devisee is not entitled to exoneration from the testator's estate or payment of the debt. All right, page 157 of the casebook, note 2. Let's go back to that. Now, how would the testator's estate be distributed if the will is silent under the new default rule 255.301 on exoneration? How would it be distributed, Mr. Navarro?
Arthur would get a house worth $200,000, and he'd have to pay $100,000.
And the $100,000 mortgage would be on that house. The house would be subject to the $100,000 mortgage, and he'd have to pay it off. And what would Brenda get?
Brenda would get $100,000.
You'd get the residuary estate worth $100,000, exactly what testator probably intended. So sometimes the exoneration rule frustrated testator's intent, even though the presumption was that it was going to carry out testator's intent. Sometimes it's frustrating. So you see, the new statutory rule, when I say it's new because I think it was added in, say when? 2005, right? 10 years ago. So that's relatively, okay, you may not think it's relatively. I started teaching, when I started teaching this course, the exoneration rule, we still follow the common law shortly thereafter to change. So 255.301 tells us exactly right, Mr. Navarro, thank you, that number 2 we distributed just as Mr. Navarro just said. $200,000 house with the $100,000 mortgage on it, subject to the $100,000 mortgage to Art, and Brenda takes the $100,000 residual estate. Now, how could testator vary that if testator wanted to vary that? How could testator say exoneration would apply? And where would you look? Could testator do it? Could testator draft around this default rule? Sure. Where would we find it?
255.302.
255.302. That's exactly right. Specific device does not pass to the devisee subject to a debt. ... If the will in which the device is made specifically states that the device passes without being subject to the debt. Okay, we can draft around it. Now, I'm going to tell you the second sentence is important, because wills often contain a so-called like general debts clause saying, I direct my personal representative or I direct my executor to pay off my debts. And see, you have that clause in there, the argument is, okay, you just drafted around the default statutory rule on exoneration. So 255.302, the second sentence says, a general provision in the will stating that debts are to be paid is not specific. It's not a specific statement. It's not specific enough for purposes of this section. That doesn't draft around the standard rule. It has to be more specific. So how could it be more specific? Why, let's look at the sample will form, shall we? And this is, I'm not finding this. I got it somewhere here. Page 470, 3A, paragraph 3A, page 470 of the will, exoneration. And here are two clauses that Professor Beyer has for you. One, if exoneration is not meant to apply, of course we don't need to include that in the will because the statute says it won't apply unless the will says it does apply. Or two, if exoneration is desired. So look, The first alternative, all specific gifts made in this will applies to specific gifts, right? That are subject to a lien or secured, like a mortgage or something like that, have a lien on them. All specific gifts made in this will pass subject to any mortgage, security, interest, or other lien existing at the date of my death without right of exoneration. That's just statutory rules, right? You don't have to dress her on that. The alternative is, look at that, if the testator really wants exoneration to apply, the second paragraph, if any specific gift made in this will is subject to mortgage, security, interest, or other lien, I direct my executor to pay the debt from other property of my estate which is not specifically given, and then exoneration would apply. Whatever the testator wants.
Since the legislature meets every 2 years and is changing statutes at whim, basically,
Yes,
would it be wise to, in
keep
real
up with
practice,
these things?
no, but in real practice, have our client go ahead and express their desire, even if their desire
I think
applies?
that's an excellent point. I think that's an excellent point. When you get out in practice, I'm just going to rephrase that a little bit.
Okay.
When you get out in practice, you're going to have to. This is a good example of this. The legislature changes. They meet every 2 years and they change the estate code. So you're going to have to keep up with the changes. The changes that you're learning in this class right now, if you graduate within the next year or so, for bar exam purposes or practice purposes, it won't change because the legislature is not going to meet again and make these changes until 2017, until about 2 years from now. But when you get out in practice, you're going to have to see what changes the legislature makes. Now, Mr. Navarro's point, and it's a good one, is, well, maybe it's not a bad idea, maybe it's good practice to put some of these specific statements in your will, even though, in your client's will, even though right now the law is such that on exoneration, for example, exoneration won't be presumed. You could be silent if testator doesn't want exoneration, and that's the default rule under the statute. But maybe the legislature will change that rule again, so discuss it with your client and stick it in there just to be safe. It doesn't hurt. You can always tell your client, the law might change, it won't cost you anything. I'll just go ahead and throw that in for free, right? That's a fair point. That's a really good point. So, on the one hand. On the other hand, sometimes we can't anticipate every crazy thing the legislature is going to do. And sometimes, if the will may just be so long, if we put every one of these default rules in the statement, but you don't know. The legislature might change it.
How do they uphold wills today that were drafted before 2009?
Well, the draft before in exoneration 2005, exoneration applied, right? The common law rule.
So they grandfathered the will?
They didn't well, they grandfathered it out, right? They applied the old common law rule. Exactly right. Yeah. So that's a good point. So go back and redraft the will, but if you go back and republish the will, you go back and redraft the will, then the will wasn't drafted before 2005. It was drafted as of today, so the new rule will apply. A little bit of the catch-22. Go back and put that in, or you'll make it clear that the old rule wouldn't apply. Okay. All right. What else do I want to tell you about this? Oh, that's probably all that I want to tell you about this. Let's talk about appreciation of property on page 157. Other questions before we do this? All right. Page 157, changes the value, appreciation, or depreciation of property. I think this is pretty much self-explanatory. And the point of note 1, 2, and 3 on page 157 is that unless testator has made it clear in her will, unless she says something different in her will, if she leaves $100,000 to John and Blackacre to Bobby, then John gets a general pecuniary gift of $100,000, no more, no less. Okay? And Bobby has a specific device. That is, John takes only the $100,000 and Bobby takes Blackacre, whether Blackacre has gone up in value or gone down in value, unless testator somehow makes it clear, my intention is to make this even and take it out of John's share of the estate if Blackacre has gone down in value, or something like that. Make it clear. Otherwise, yeah. Bobby takes Blackacre, whether it goes up or down. It's not the result the testator wants. The testator has to clearly indicate this in the will. Again, this is showing you, we talked about this tonight, we've talked about it many times, and some of you have asked questions about this. Where the will is silent, there are an awful lot of questions about interpreting the will. What did testator really want? There are these kinds of situations: satisfaction, redemption, exoneration, appreciation or depreciation of the value of a specifically devised asset. Those kinds of things. So there's a need when the will is silent for either common law rules or statutory rules that provide default rules to handle these situations that they can be drafted around. You just have to know what the rules are to know if you need to draft it. That's exactly the point. All right. How about gifts and securities on page 158? You want to do that? Yeah, you should. Okay. All right. You talked me into it. If you said no, I was going to do it. I can do that. What I want to do is, the authors talk, Professor Byer talks about 255 point, 251, 52, and 53 in the statutes that deal with some of these situations. And I want to make some important points here because I usually ask a question about changes in securities on the final exam. And sometimes it's a multiple choice question where there's just one clear right answer. Sometimes it is questions, another one of my short answer questions, where you have to explain your answer. And I'm going to tell you what's the wrong answer that students often give, or what's a partial answer that gets partial credit as opposed to the answer that gets full credit. So let's look first at what happened, I guess, in the O'Neill versus Alford case. Let's look at the notes on page 161, and let's handle O'Neill by looking at the notes. How would O'Neill be decided under the applicable provisions of the estate code? Okay, that's what I want to know. Let's start with that first. So let's look at 255. So 255.152, right? 252. You know, it took me years to learn the numbers in the old code. They changed it. You know, section 71 and a half A. All right, I could deal with that. No, it's 255.252 or 255.252. Yeah, you get the deal for that. All right. Okay, it's a default rule. Look at this. Look at the first clause of that. Unless the will of the testator clearly provides otherwise, stop right there. This is a default rule that can be drafted around. This is one of these many default rules, but it's a statutory rule that deals with changes in securities. Okay, so that's it. Now, how does 255 and 252 work in the Alford facts? What were the Alford facts? Who wants to take that? Who wants to tell me what the facts are and then tell me how the statute applies in this case? Anyone want to? Or y'all, somebody always preaching out here. Yes, Mr. Don't tell me you are Spencer, right? Okay, Mr. Spencer, yes.
Well, Mrs. Marshall had 68 shares at the time that she wrote the will, but she listed 69.
Yeah, of Eastman Kodak. Is Eastman Kodak still in business? Are they still in business? They stopped making film, didn't they? Yeah, that's incredible. When I was a kid growing up, and some of you, I don't want to say, about anyone's age, so I'll just say all of you are younger than me. But in the old days, Kodak made the film. They were the big film makers, and that's the cameras. Now everything's digital, and there's no film anymore. It's incredible. The world is not necessarily better. I like it when that film, but what are you going to do? Because you had Kodachrome, and Kodachrome is just beautiful. Your mom was an accountant for Eastman Kodak. Wow. I hope that she didn't take all of her retirement in her stock. Okay, yeah, it is.
They're doing okay.
Well, good. That's good to hear. Eastman Kodak, in the very old days, in the 60s, when I was a little kid growing up, my grandmother had Eastman Kodak shares. Eastman Kodak was one of the great stocks. Polaroid was another one. Is there even Polaroid anymore? All right. So, Mr. Spencer, back to you, though. Her will said she left. Actually, I think her will said she got 69 shares, then it was maybe 60, but she really only owned 68. But don't worry about that difference, because when she died, she owned more than 68 or 69 shares of Kodak. Because when she died, she left it to her nephew. Kodak had done what? They had a 2-for-1 split, so there were 136 shares, right? And so the question was, she had a specific device, right? She had Kodak stock. It was identifiable in her estate. It was said 68, 69 shares. Well, say 68, there were 136. So her nephew said, well, great, I take all 136 shares, and her executor said, no, you just take the 68 shares, or 69 shares that she left in her will. That was a specific request. You take no more, no less. Anything else, you don't take. What results under 252, 255.252, and why?
You took all 136 shares.
And that's the court arrived at that too, because the predecessor statute had just been enacted, and the court said it wasn't in effect yet. But the court said, well, let's look at what the statute's going to do. All right, maybe that's a little bit of judicial overreach, judicial legislation, but what the heck? But it's clear, the statute makes clear that he would take all the shares, and why? Can you read me the pertinent language in 255.252? Are we in subsection 1 or subsection 2? The what? You're exactly right in subsection 1. So unless the will of the testator clearly provides otherwise, if you wrap it around, but then, what does it say? Device of securities, and you're doing great here. Here, you read it. I'm sorry. I'm feeling your thunder here.
Securities of an organization acquired because of an action initiated by an organization, or in successor related to acquiring an organization, including stock splits.
Stop right there, okay? So unless the will clarifies otherwise, the device of securities, the will, they're owned by the testator on the date when the will was executed. This is what happened here. She owned 68, 69 shares, 68 actually, when the will was executed. It includes the following additional securities, additional shares, subsequently acquired by the testator as a result of the testator's ownership of device securities. These kind of securities, subsection 1, securities of the same organization acquired because of well, the action initiated by the organization, including stock splits, and that's what we had, the stock split. So the executor, and under the statute, this is a clear, this is an easy case, right? The executor's wrong. The nephew doesn't take just 69 shares, 68 shares. The executor takes everything. Okay. Then what if the situation were reversed? What if there had been a so-called reverse split? This happens sometimes too. So instead of 68 shares, she dies with 34 shares. And the executor says, you take nothing because, in fact, there aren't 68 shares. That's what you're supposed to take. There's only 34 shares. You're technically redeemed. It'd be the same result. You take 34 shares. Whether it's up or whether it's down, sometimes there's so-called reverse stock splits. Doesn't matter. Subsection 1 would give all the shares, whatever they are, of Eastern Kodak to the beneficiary. What if, before her death, she will silent and she sold Eastern Kodak, all those shares of Eastern Kodak, and she bought shares of General Motors Corporation? What would the nephew take? The will, she died, will silent on point, other than saying 68 shares of Eastern Kodak stock for my beloved nephew. He dies with 100 shares of General Motors and no shares of Eastern Kodak. Would it be? I think that's exactly right. Did it change in form only? I don't think so. Okay? I don't think so. I really do. All right. Very good. How about, let's see, this. Let's look at the notes. Oh, note 2 on page 161. The classification of testamentary gift may depend not only on its wording, but on the issue currently before the court. I'm just going to tell you, note 2 on page 161, 255.252 makes those questions in note 2 moot. The statute takes care of that. Okay? Will can draft around it, but we don't have to ask those kinds of questions anymore, I don't believe, in note 2 on page 161. How about, let's see what else I want to say. Let's look at note 3, and let's see kind of how this will work in practice. Testator owned 100 shares of XYZ stock. Testator's will left my 100 shares of XYZ stock to Willie, and the rest of the estate to Ethel. All the rest of the residuary of my estate to Ethel. Prior to testator's death, XYZ stock declared and paid a cash dividend of $1 per share. Upon testator's death, who is entitled to that $100? What do you think? And where would you look? Where would you look for the answer? Will is silent. Where would you look for the answer? What statute? What section or subsection? Go .253, exactly right, 255.253. It tells us, Mr. Golightly, unless the will of the testator clearly provides otherwise, once again, this is a default rule that can be drafted around. A device of securities does not include a cash distribution relating to securities that accrues before the testator's death, regardless of whether the distribution is paid before the testator's death. A device of securities does not include a cash distribution, like a dividend, relating to the securities that accrues before the testator's death. So, who takes? Prior to testator's death, XYZ declared and paid the cash dividend of $100. Who takes? I think whoever the residual estate, I think it's epic. Because see, it talks about not when it's paid, but when it accrues. Right? It doesn't include a cash distribution relating to the securities that accrues before the testator's death. I don't really think that's what the average testator would. I think they plan for that $100 to go along to Willie, who is taking the shares that they relate to, but that's just something they have to draft around this. I am going to tell you, problem 3A, I've never asked a question like that. Okay. 3C, you better watch. Offered situation, better watch. 3A, I've never asked. How about 3B? After testator's death, XYZ declared and paid cash dividend of $1 per share. Who's entitled to that? It accrues after. Willie, I think that's right. It accrues after. I'm not sure that this is what the average testator would intend. But again, the good news on 3A and 3B is I've never asked a question like that on the final exam. And I'm going to tell you right now, I won't start in December. Okay? 3A and 3B, you don't have to worry about. I'm not going to ask you about dividends. If I ask you about dividends, there it is for what it's worth, 255.253, but I'm not going to ask about that. However, problem 3C on page 161. I sure do sometimes ask about that, or ask about the offered situation. Who takes? Prior to testator's death, XYZ merged with Acme Corporation. Testator then received 200 shares of, I don't know, 200 shares of Acme stock. Upon testator's death, who is entitled to the 200 shares? Because testator said to my beloved friend, nephew, son, grandson, whatever, Willie, my 100 shares of XYZ stock, and on testator's death, there is no XYZ stock, there is 200 shares of Acme stock. Mr. Jensen, you want to tell me?
I would say Willie.
Willie takes in why? Tell me exactly.
Section 255.252, subsection 2.
This is subsection 2, okay? And this is important, and I want to. This is the one that sometimes I ask, and students will kind of get partial credit only because they'll get this one. Okay. So this is, unless the will provides otherwise, the device of securities that are owned by the testator on the date the will is executed. That's the 100 shares of XYZ Corporation, right? Includes the following additional securities subsequently acquired by the testator as a result of the testator's ownership of the devised securities, and that is subsection 2, securities of another organization, that's the Acme stock, right? Acquired as a result of merger. There it is. Okay? So the statute's right on point. All right. So that's the right answer. There's a statute on point. You get this question, as I sometimes ask, there's a statute on point that tells you what the right answer in this situation is. Sometimes students will say, and the old common law rule, when we didn't have this statute, the old common law rule was, well, the exemption might apply, right? So you have to say, well, that it changes in form only because the companies, you don't have to, the companies merge. You don't have to do that now. All you got to do is say, there's a statute on point. The statute says that if there's been a reorganization of stock, you have other securities, the testator has other securities because of a corporate merger, the devisee takes those other securities. Boom, there it is in the statute. All right? Question, you don't have to say, well, is there an exception to that? It really didn't change form. It changed in form only. Or did she involuntarily part with it because there was a reorganization? You don't have to do that. There's a statute on point. Question about that? Okay. Great. Hearing none, let's talk 162 about interest. Oh, hell, I've never asked a question about interest, but gosh, I got a lot I want to get to. I want to get to abatement. I want to get to divorce annulment. All right. You know what? Don't worry about it. I'm just not going to ask you about it. worry about that on 162 about interest rate. So now we've worked another half page. And that's good. Abatement on page 162. This is the default rule is treated in section 355.109 of the estate code. And what I want to talk about, look at note 3 first on page 162. May testator specify how abatement is to be done? Well, what the hell is abatement? When would abatement come up? What's abatement? Okay. Yes, it's a reduction in device, and why would there have to be a reduction in device in the gift to the beneficiary, some or all the beneficiaries in the will?
Well, section 355.109
It gives a list, but just generally, why would we even have to look at 355.109?
From what I'm gathering, and
Right, together, yeah.
it has something to do with the fact that there was a credit on it.
Okay. There's one like that. Yeah, there might be enough debts that have to be paid from testator's property so that all of the gifts in the will can't be satisfied, can't be gifted, can't be distributed. We have to start reducing some or all. We have to start abating. That's the term abating. There has to be abatement of some of them, a reduction of some of them, because we can't satisfy it in the will. So, I guess the first question is, what if testator is entirely insolvent? What if I say, I leave you $1 million and I die, I've got no money left? Well, you won't take anything. Everything's going to be abated in that case, right? If the estate's insolvent. But what if the estate can satisfy some, but not all of the gifts that are in the will? Well, some of the gifts are going to have to be reduced. How are we going to reduce them? How are we going to abate them? Well, the first thing we do is look at what the will says. Look at, because again, this is another default rule. This is a statutory rule that can be drafted around. Look at page 470 of the form will, and look at Article 3B on page 470 in your case bill, 470 in the form will, abatement. I direct the gifts made in this will abate, be reduced, in the following order, and then testator says what order. If testator doesn't say what order, 355.109 is going to give us the order that abatement will occur. And we're going to see in a second, it might not be the order that every testator would want. I mean, I think the legislature did a pretty good job in 355.109 of guessing what the average testator would want. That's just a guess what their intention would be. So if the testator, your client wants something different, then you better draft it in the will. Okay. Okay. So back to 355.109. It'll help if I get on the right page here, and we're on page 282 in the statutory supplement. Look at subsection C. 355.109 subsection C. A decedent's intent expressed in a will controls over the abatement request provided by this section. What does that mean? It means this is a default rule, and testator can draft around it just like Professor Byer was setting up the model will to draft around it. But if it's not drafted around, then subsection A gives the general rule as to what order devices in a will, requests devices in a will, abate. And look at the order, subsection A. First off, if the will doesn't dispose of everything, if there's a partial intestacy, the property passing by intestacy gets abated first. In other words, that doesn't get paid first. Okay? Then, look at 2 and 3. The next thing that we abate, the next thing we reduce, the next type of property we reduce is personal property of the residuary, and then real property of the residuary estate. This is another one of those situations where we have to classify the type of bequest or the type of device. Is it residuary? Is it general? Is it demonstrative? Is it specific? Because the abatement order you'll see, in most abatement is specific. That's the last thing to abate, as we'll see in just a moment. Then look at 4 and 5. General bequests of personal property and general devices of real property. A general device of real property is fairly rare. It's more likely to be personal property. But you see, residuary goes first, the testacy goes first, residuary goes second, general devices go next, and finally, the last thing to abate, the last thing that's going to be reduced, the thing that we really are going to pay to give to the beneficiary first, is number 6, specific bequests of personal property, and number 7, specific devices of real property. That is, personal property in each category will abate, if less favored, will be reduced before real property in that category. Notice something else. We got to classify the kinds of devices to apply 355.1 on subsection A of the abatement rule, the default statutory abatement rule. What kind of bequests or devices aren't treated there in the statute? What? Demonstrative. Demonstrative, right? The demonstrative is there. I heard it here, but I knew I'd read it in mind. I knew you can add that. Okay, demonstrative. So this is an interesting little question of statutory interpretation. Demonstrative bequests, how often do they come up? Rarely. I said that. I just generally don't ask about them on the final exam, and I doubt that I'll change that practice in Senate. That's one of the stuff I can ask you about the demonstrative devices, or advices, as the case may be. The statute doesn't deal with demonstrative bequests. Now, I'm going to tell you that this statute basically codified the common law rules. Before this statute was there, the common law said residuary intestacy, property passing by intestacy abates first, then residuary, then general, then specific and demonstrative, and specific and demonstrative were treated as most favored. They were treated equal. They were treated equally favored. They were the last to abate. Demonstrative bequests were abated at the same time specific bequests were abated. Okay, that was the common law rule. This statute codified the common law rule, but the legislature forgot to say anything about demonstrative bequests. My guess, and it's only a guess, is, and this is just kind of a matter of statutory interpretation, my guess is when the statute recodified the common law rule and left out demonstrative bequests, I think demonstrative bequests would still be most favored, would still be treated as if they were specific bequests, just like the common law rule was. But I don't know. I'm not going to ask you that on the final exam. Okay? I might ask you about abating specific bequests versus general versus residuary. And you'll just have to know the general order if the will is silent. This is the order they abate in. And of course, in each category, personal property is less favored. It abates before real property in that same category. Okay? That's the abatement order. So that is basically the answer to Note 1, the question Note 1 on page 162 of the page book. Note 1, what is the abatement order? I just told you. Set out 355.109 subsection A. Remember, subsection C tells us this can be drafted around. Okay? Incidentally, what about property tax? Property tax. Estate tax, not property tax. Estate tax. Estate tax. I didn't ask you to look at the estate tax rules. In fact, tax apportionment, page 163, I told you to skip that, right? Okay? I'm not going to test you on this, but I'm just going to point it out to you. You don't need to know the tax rules. Chapter 124 of the Estate Code, which you don't need to know, has really a rather complex and special set of rules for apportioning, that is, allocating the burden of any estate tax. And the basic rule is it doesn't abate in the same way that 355.109 gifts kind of abate. Taxes instead, estate taxes are generally apportioned pro rata. So if testator leaves you $100,000 and needs a residuary of the estate, and the residuary estate is worth $100,000, and testator has $200,000 that owes some estate tax on it, it will not abate first out of the residuary estate like it would here. Instead, it would abate pro rata, and if there was $50,000 of estate tax, your share would bear $25,000, my share would bear $25,000. Okay? But don't worry about that. I'm not going to test you on estate taxes. I didn't ask you to read about estate taxes. In fact, estate taxes aren't really a factor in estates unless the estates are each worth, unless each estate is worth, I think, up to, they index for inflation and I think we're up to about 5.2 or 5.3 million dollars right now. So, and that means if it's a husband and wife and they're both leaving, and it's all community property, they can leave over $10 million between the two of them before there's any federal estate tax. So, I really think it's a practical matter. Yes, we have a state gift tax class, and some of you might want to do estate planning, you might want to work on big estates, might get both work on big estates, and there's some tax planning that's involved with those estates. So it won't affect the average person. How many people here who are married have one estate worth more than $10 million? Please raise your hand. Please let me know. Yeah, right. Yeah. I'm rich, but I'm not that rich either. So, none of I'd be surprised. I'm teasing you, of course. One of you in this room might have that, and I don't want to know that for your business. I was teasing. I really did. Okay. Let's see what else I want to say about this. Let's apply. What are the things? Look at the order. Let's talk about the abatement order in 355-109 subsection A. You think this is what the average decedent would intend, that specific devices abate last or most favored, and residuary devices, well, intestacy maybe, but residuary is the first thing to abate? Maybe. What if I? What? The will is silent, but I leave $100,000 to my beloved wife, and all the rest and residue. Now let me change that. I leave $100,000 to my best friend Bob, all the rest and residue of my estate to my beloved wife. And at the time I draft that, I have an estate. I'm worth $1 million, so I'm thinking my wife's going to take $900,000. When I die, in fact, we've got to abate this because my estate's only worth $50,000. Do you think I'd want my wife to take nothing and my best friend to take $50,000? That's what 355.109 would say. I don't know. But we may have to wrap around it. So I just want to point that out. Now let's look at how this works in Note 2 on page 162. Ken's will contains the following dispositive language. Okay, page 162, Note 2. Let's actually see how this works in a real life situation. I leave my gold watch to X. What kind of bequest or device is that? This is specific, okay? I leave $10,000 to A and I leave $5,000 to B. What kind of bequests or devices are those? General, exactly right. I leave the remainder of my estate, all the rest and residue of my estate to C. What do we call that? What's that? That's the residuary, okay? What might pass by intestacy in that situation? Anything? Assuming all those people survive the testator? No, nothing. The estate is completely disposed of. There's no partial intestacy. What if what if C predeceases Ken or doesn't survive Ken by 120 hours, the default rule? And where would the residuary estate go? Ken dies with one estranged blood relative, his only heir at law, Ken G. Where would the rest after the gold watch and $15,000 to A and B go? I mean, there's $1 million left, and she died before Ken. Where would it go? Yes, because Ken's heirs. I mean, we would have a partial intestacy in that situation, but there's no indication that there's a partial intestacy here because if A, B, C, and X all survive Ken, then we dispose of all of Ken's estate. All right. Ken's estate, when Ken dies, has $20,000 in cash and the gold watch. Right? Gold watch, whatever gold watch is worth, has a market value of $25,000. Wonderful. If we don't have abatement, X will take the gold watch, $20,000 in cash. $10,000 will go to A, $5,000 will go to B, and the remainder of the estate, the other $5,000 goes to C. But oh hell, look at this. There are $12,500 worth of debts, funeral expenses, administrative expenses, etc. Now, how should Ken's estate be distributed? Because after all, there's $45,000 in value in the estate, $25,000 in the gold watch, $20,000 in cash, and $12,500 are debts. $12,500 from $45,000 is $32,500. Well, that ought to be enough, but no, it isn't. How's it going to abate if the will is silent? How are we going to distribute estate under 355.109, subsection A, what does it tell us? What abates first and what abates last? Grant?
The residuary theoretically would be the first thing to go, but there's not enough to cover it.
That's right, there's not enough to cover it, so what?
At least 15,000 in general.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Okay, there's still 15,000 in general bequest. The residuary would be the first to abate. The residuary divides each C is going to be SOL, right? She's not going to take anything. And in fact, there's not, as we're going to see in just a moment, that we're talking in value, but the specific item is going to be the last to abate, isn't it? So X takes the gold watch no matter what the value is, unless the estate is insolvent, right? So he's going to take that. So how much cash is left in the estate?
$7,500.
$7,500 is left in the estate, and what testator Ken wanted was a total of $15,000 to go to A and B. There's not enough to satisfy those two requests. So X is going to take the gold watch because the specific gift abates last. There's no specific gift of real property, but it's personal property. That abates last. Ken will take that. There's enough to pay Ken that. There's not enough to pay C. The residuary abates first. Too bad, so sad for C. C doesn't have enough. And there's $7,500 in cash to pay A and B. That's not enough. So the general devices to A and B are going to partially abate. A and B are going to split the $7,500, right? How? Well, how do they split it?
It goes pro rata.
It does go pro rata. What does the statute say?
That its probate in the estate is not sufficient to pay testator's debts, including taxes, and the devices. Then some of the gifts have to be reduced in order of what will abate pro rata first.
But does the statute tell us anything about does it say pro rata in there?
No.
It doesn't say pro rata, does it? Right? The statute's silent about whether it abates pro rata. But there are the early cases under the common law seem to indicate that the abatement would be pro rata, and that would be my answer on the final exam too, if I were answering. You can answer however you want to, but remember, I'm great. Okay. So the abatement would be pro rata in problem 2 on page 162, and a pro rata abatement. How are we going to distribute $7,500 if Ken wanted A to take $10,000 and B to take $5,000? How would we do that?
You would double whatever the share is.
And how many? So how many shares are we going to divide this into?
3.
3, exactly right. Because
2 parts to 1.
okay, that's 5,000 each. Each share is 5,000. That's 2 parts to A, right? And B is 5. Yes, A and B, right? And B would take 1 part. Okay, now we've got $7,500. So what do we do? Divide by 3, right? Each share is now $2,500. These are 5,000. Okay. Now each share is $2,500. B takes 1 share because Ken wanted, and A takes 2 because Ken wanted A to have twice as much as B. So B's going to have that, and A is going to have that.
And
Right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
X takes off like a bandit.
And X makes out like a bandit. Right? What if the gold watch at the time of testator's executed the will, the gold watch was worth $5,000, but the testator's death it was worth $25,000? It's great for X. He really makes out like a bandit. That's it. Because that specific request abates last. Testator wanted something different. He should have said something different. Okay? Question about number 2. That's a good little example of how things abate. And I think probably my guess is most of you probably, without looking at the statute, most of you probably could have just figured that out intuitively. All right. Let me ask you one other question. Look at note 4 on page 162. This is a recent case in re estate of Anderegg, I guess is how to pronounce it. Testator's will provided that all debts and expenses should be paid out of my estate. Both the trial courts and the appellate courts held that this statement was sufficient to alter the statutory abatement order. Look at subsection C, 355-109, subsection C. A decedent's intent expressed in a will controls over the abatement of the trust provided by this section. This can alter the order. So testator's debts were paid pro rata from all the estate property rather than things abating in the order set out in subsection A. The courts rejected the argument that testator's language was too general to alter the statutory order, what do you think? What do you think testator is making? Do you think the court got the case right? What do you think? Yes? No? I mean, they certainly came up with a fair, pro rata, just as fair. And for taxes, it is pro rata, just as fair, but that's not the statutory scheme. So the question is, was testator specific enough in his will to alter the statutory order? The court said, yeah, that general statement was specific enough to alter the statutory order. I'm not convinced. I'm just telling you, I'm not convinced. I don't know.
If the testator was aware of the order in 355-109, maybe, but
yeah, maybe if he was aware.
Yeah.
We have to have extrinsic evidence
But
to see what in court.
otherwise,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think that's an interesting situation. I'm not sure the court got the case right, but there it is. Those are on the books, and that's the rule for those books.
Across the board like that, it goes to specific gift, something that's tangible. And I know it goes, the pro rata, whoever receives that device, he's gonna have to put back in the pocket. Say I'm only getting the watch.
Mm-hmm.
And it went pro rata across the board.
How does that go pro rata? I only get half the watch. What happened? What do you think might happen to that as a practical
I
matter?
think you have to.
Yeah, the court. Well, no, I think the court might order the watch sold, and then you take half the proceeds. Yeah, and that may not be what you want, because it's going to be ordered sold perhaps at a fire sale at a public auction, and they might not bring it. There's all sorts of little complications there.
In that circumstance, it's like you're not using the pay on the deposit.
Might be able to do that. Let's have it valued, and some of that might be subject to negotiation among the beneficiaries, right? Or that in that situation, the person would say, okay, I'm only going to get half the proceeds, but half the proceeds from what? From the sale. I'll just reserve the public auction. I'll reach into my pocket. Maybe no one else will care, and I can buy the watch for $100, and I'll get the proceeds plus I'll have bought the watch. I'll get half the proceeds. So there are a lot of little practical situations that I'll probably be on the scope of what I'm asking on the final exam, but good points are. Yeah. Okay. Page 167. Let's talk about marriage, and then I guess we're going to be finished here. I'm going to tell you next time we're going to talk about marriage. Then I'll start with divorce and annulment on page 168, and then I'm going to spend, I think, most likely the entire rest of the class on Tuesday night working on those problems and working with the statutes on pretermitted children. I'll test you on pretermitted children. It'll be on the final exam, believe me. And there's a good chance the bar examiners will test you on pretermitted children too. And it could even come up in real life, and the statute, I think, is a mess. I think the statute is probably not what, sometimes it's not at all what the average decedent would want, and it's pretty complex. So we'll work through the statute. We'll start there next time. Let me just say something quickly about marriage, bottom 167, top of 168, as opposed to divorce and annulment. We'll start with divorce and annulment next time. In many states, there is, this came up on the bar exam a couple of years ago. Many states have a pretermitted spouse statute. That is, in many states, if I have a will, and I make a will when I'm single, and I leave my entire estate to dear old Mumsy, and then I get married, and don't change my will, and I die, many states have a statute that says marriage revokes my will. Marriage revokes my will. And therefore, I would die intestate, and my spouse would be my primary heir. See how that protects the spouse? Okay? That's not the rule in Texas. There is no pretermitted spouse statute. There is no rule that marriage revokes my will. So in Texas, I have a will. I'm single. I make my will. Everything to dear old Mumsy. I get married, and I die shortly after that. Marriage doesn't revoke my will. Say I've got $1 million in separate property. Goes to my mouse. About my mom, my dear old Mumsy. I'll say mouse, right? My mom, not my spouse, right? Not my wife. Marriage does not revoke my will. So what in Texas would protect my wife? Why should we keep her share of the community property? But if I died very shortly after the marriage, there might be virtually no community property. This is why other states have this pretermitted spouse rule. Texas doesn't. It doesn't apply in Texas. Marriage has no effect on my will. If I draft my will and leave my property to someone other than my wife when I'm not married, well, would I leave it to my wife if I'm not married, right? And then I get married, unless it's that person that I'm married doesn't deduct it, it goes to the other person, not my spouse. Y'all die intestate, my spouse isn't my taxes. Question about that? No? 9:15 exactly, we're finished. Have a good weekend, everyone. I will see you on Tuesday when